I'm here tonight to speak about war, terror, jihad, and justice, 4 words for the 21st century, as part of a program sponsored by the Open Classroom. The main point I want to make tonight is the Al-Qaeda group, led by Osama bin Laden, is more similar to a cult than it is to anything else, and it bears much more resemblance to the radical groups of the 1960s, or perhaps of Jim Jones and the tragic events of Jamestown, than it does to much in Islamic history. It is therefore more like the Red Brigades, the Red Army faction, or the Weathermen than it is like anything else. The question, though, that I want to address tonight is what allowed such a group to emerge in the Middle East and in South Asia, and also to disentangle the relationship between the rhetoric of Islam that this group employs, the actions they have undertaken, and the reasons they have achieved some popularity among sections of the populations in Arab and Muslim countries. In this talk, I want to explain why what happened at the World Trade Center was an act of war, and what it means that this act of war was committed by private individuals rather than by a state. I also want to explain why the people who carried it out claim to have been engaged in jihad rather than in war or terror, and why most Orthodox Muslim leaders have denied that claim. Lastly, I want to comment on the role of the United States in the world today if we are to achieve a greater measure of peace and justice in the world. To understand what is happening today, we need to understand the pervasive character of war and dictatorship in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, as well as how modern ideas about war and terror emerged, the ways in which 20th century Muslims reconceptualized classical Islamic doctrines about jihad, and the meaning of justice in the international order. To discuss the context within which the assault on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon occurred, and the concepts by which those who did it justified it in their own minds, requires us to look deeply into the great religious traditions, and to recall that all great religious traditions are complex, that they engage in constant debates over fundamental meanings, and that these debates have gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it is important in this context to realize that all such traditions emphasize that human beings have free will. The mere existence of a text or an interpretation is not sufficient to guarantee that religious concepts cannot be employed in the pursuit of intolerance, violence, or evil. We must all confront, as the Quran reminds us, the whisperings of Satan in our own hearts. What about war? The attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon killed thousands of people, but the U.S. government says that it was an act of war, not an act of murder. To understand what kind of war it is and the importance of war in our world, we have to look back in history at least a little bit. War is conflict between states. But until the 16th century, states were the property of kings or princes. And therefore, when states went to war, rulers expected to get property. They expected to get slaves, subjects, land, tribute, or simply plunder. After the 16th century, modern world states emerged, and they ceased to be the property of individuals. States became the representatives of nations. And during this period, the nature of war changed, because technology made war far more destructive than it had ever been in the past, and because increasingly wars were fought for ideological reasons. Consequently, by the 17th century, civilians became subject to warfare. They were no longer simply the objects of war, to be enslaved or to lose their property. And in this period, rules of war were developed in Europe and the Americas. The consequence of these changes in rules was that states undertook the responsibility for any acts of violence carried out against other states by their own inhabitants. The emergence of the modern state system required a prolonged conflict, fought with military, political, and legal instruments against those who attempted to use violence for private purposes, against piracy, against the use of mercenaries, and against private acts of revenge by individuals carried out on the territory of other states. Modern wars are fought between states that employ all the resources at their disposal, but modern states agree not to allow conflicts between them to be created by private individuals, and they also agree not to use certain kinds of weapons and not to deliberately attack certain kinds of targets. Thus, for example, despite widespread sympathy for the Palestinians in the Arab world, even the Arab states most unwilling to make peace with Israel have placed very heavy restrictions on the activity of Palestinian guerrillas, and therefore the borders have often been quiet, although the airwaves have been filled with anger. Nevertheless, the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia during the late 20th century have been zones of war. And probably the people of these regions have had more experience with war than almost any other part of the globe. The Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988, in which 500,000 people lost their lives and another 500,000 people were injured. The Arab-Israeli wars, in which thousands of people were killed. The Egyptian war in Yemen, sometimes referred to as Egypt's Vietnam, with thousands of victims between 1962 and 1968. The civil war in Lebanon, in which over 130,000 people from a population of 4 million were killed in a 15-year-long war. The Algerian War of Independence between 1954 and 1962, which claimed perhaps 1 million victims, and the Algerian Civil War from 1990 to the present, which has certainly had hundreds of thousands of victims. There has also been a civil war in Sudan, effectively a war of conquest by the North in the South, the Tunisian War of Independence, and a war by Libya in Chad. The South Asian Islamic countries have also been a zone of war and of dictatorship, whether in Pakistan, along the Indo-Pakistani frontier, during a brutal war waged against the population of Bangladesh by the government of Pakistan in the early 1970s, and 2 decades of war in Afghanistan, first against the Soviet Union and then by Afghans against Afghans. And it was this latter war that was routinely called a jihad and that attracted support from individual Muslims, from Arab governments, from Pakistani intelligence, and from the U.S. Central Intelligence Administration. The Middle East and South Asia have not only suffered the physical destruction and moral hardening that usually accompany war, but have also become zones in which large areas of entire countries have become effectively stateless and have therefore passed, as in the case of Afghanistan, under the control of militias, warlords, and occasionally bandits. They have therefore become not only havens for those who wish to inflict harm on the larger world, they have actually, on occasion, become territory under the effective control of such people. Now, the U.S. government calls the attack on the World Trade Center an act of terror. What does it mean to call something an act of terror, and what is the link between war and terror? Terror is war deliberately fought against society by the use of random violence. With rare and strategic exceptions, there was no terror before the 18th century because it was neither possible nor desirable to wage war on society. The very few exceptions would be the Romans and the Mongols, who destroyed entire cities on occasion because those cities had refused to surrender. But the idea of an ideological conflict waged by the use of random violence against society was literally inconceivable. The French Revolution was probably the first instance of modern terror because in that case, society's own political leaders waged a war not only against each other, but on their own society to obliterate their real and perceived enemies and to destroy any desire on the part of the population to engage in political action. In the succeeding 2 centuries, we have observed 2 major forms of terror. One by political activists seeking to attack and to kill political leaders more or less at random, and the other by states attacking their own societies. As an example of the first form of terror, we know the history of European anarchists and of the National Liberation Movement in Algeria. But as an example of the second, far more far-reaching terror, we have the example of Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. Many different ideological vocabularies have been employed to justify the use of terror. And the use of random violence, especially in the service of ideological aims, has become a feature of modern life and forces us to examine some of the most pressing ethical and political dilemmas of our times. Because it is a feature of modern society, no religious tradition has had sufficient time fully to adapt to its presence, whether, for example, any random use of violence is forbidden, or whether, in some cases, it might be considered acceptable. It is nevertheless incorrect to say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, or at least anti-colonial warrior. Some freedom fighters, like the French or Russian revolutionaries, claimed quite openly that they had the right to employ terror, indiscriminate violence against society, in behalf of their goals, and they proclaimed this idea quite loudly. Others have proclaimed their right to inflict indiscriminate violence as part of their conflict against colonial power. Other freedom fighters have avoided the use of terror. And here, of course, we think of Mahatma Gandhi or perhaps Martin Luther King, who abjured the use of indiscriminate violence. The men who attacked the World Trade Center, however, did not call what they did either war or terror. They used a different term. They used the word jihad. They used this term because they believed it would generate support for them in the Arab and Islamic world. And in fact, it has generated some popular support, but almost no acceptance by Muslim clerics. To understand why this is the case, we need to begin with the knowledge that jihad is a concept found in the Quran that dates to the 7th century AD, but that it is a concept that has constantly been evaluated and whose implications for the world have changed. Historical context, then, of the notion of jihad, as we find it first, is of a world of states that were, as in Europe, the property of rulers, as well as a world of constant tribal warfare in the Arabian Peninsula, coupled with the emergence of a new monotheist religion. Strategic survival of this religion and the community that it represented required that it undertake war, defensive and occasionally offensive. There was a consequent concern on the part of those who followed this religion with issues of conversion to Islam, of tribute, of plunder, of taxation, and of enslavement. And in fact, in the Quran and in the Sunnah, the actions of the Prophet and the Hadith, words attributed to him, as well as in later Islamic law, we find significant concern on the part of legal thinkers in Islam to ameliorate the effects of war. The theory of jihad that was finally developed placed war or jihad primarily in the context of defending existing Islamic communities from armed assault, and it required the explicit warning to those against whom jihad was to be launched. These were not the only concerns of Muslim thinkers with jihad, but it was an important set of concerns for a very long time. And the developed law of jihad that Muslim thinkers developed in the early Middle Ages resembled the laws of warfare that developed in Europe and the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. In this law of jihad, war was the prerogative of the state rather than of individuals or tribes. And legal thinkers understood very clearly the need to protect non-combatants. And they even excluded certain practices that, had they been followed, would have sown terror among civilian populations. Consequently, Muslim legal thinkers prohibited the poisoning of wells and the use of fire. It is not surprising, therefore, that generally speaking, Orthodox Muslim religious figures have condemned the attack on the World Trade Center because it was aimed neither at converting non-Muslims nor at defending Muslims against any immediate threat to their sovereignty, and because it employed methods that are not only heinous in general, but have been specifically forbidden in Islam for hundreds of years. Having condemned the attack on the World Trade Center, however, does not necessarily lead these Muslim clerics to accept a war in Afghanistan. What they condemn is the criminal act of individuals, which cannot, in the framework within which they operate, be repaired by attacking a state. The technical definition of jihad, however, is not the popular understanding of the term today. What the hijackers really employed was one of several competing concepts about jihad that have become popular today among broad sections of the Muslim world. So to skip over much of the history of Islam and to come down quickly to the 20th century, we want to look at Islam as a dynamic religion whose practitioners constantly reshape older concepts and beliefs. And we notice as they do this three very distinct ways of talking about jihad. One that has emerged in the early 20th century was the idea that jihad was no longer a matter of physical violence, but the conflict of the believer over his conscience and his own actions, a form of self-control. And this was usually referred to by the Arabic words jihad an-nafs, which means the jihad of the soul. Now, what's interesting about this is that the popularity of the concept as jihad as a form of self-control arose and became widespread despite the knowledge of many Muslims that it is found only in a very weak association with the words of the Prophet Muhammad. It is nevertheless instructive in this regard that Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, subscribed to the notion that the highest jihad was self-control. There were, however, other ways of interpreting the meaning of jihad for the 20th century, and one was as a response to the emergence of secular anti-colonial movements in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. By the mid-1930s, Hassan al-Banna, a leader of the Egyptian Islamic movement, called for Muslims to wage jihad against European colonial rule that stretched from the French domination of Morocco through the English hegemony of Egypt to the Dutch rule in Indonesia. And when al-Banna wrote this call, he pointed out that the argument of jihad an-nafs, or the battle for self-control, was in fact not what he considered jihad to be. What is therefore important to grasp is that these competing meanings of jihad were not given in any original texts of Islam, but were the creative response of political activists and thinkers in the 20th century Muslim world, rather than receptions of traditional scholars. The importance then of opposing colonialism and arguing for jihad was to find a way to assert the role of Muslim thinkers and Muslim organizations in the anti-colonial movement, and also to find a way for them to assume power in the post-colonial era. And in fact, we might expect that with the end of colonialism, all talk of jihad as violence would end. But what became the case in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia was that with the end of colonial rule, it was apparent that there was a growing impact of European institutions and concepts throughout the Muslim world. We can refer to this as cultural borrowing or assimilation, but for many people, it appeared as a form of cultural assault. And in fact, many thinkers developed the notion that borrowing from the West or the intrusion of European culture into their world was a form of ghazwa fikri, or cultural assault. What this implied was then that the European world and the United States were waging war by other means. And the implication was that contemporary Muslims were threatened by cultural change that would lead to their assimilation into a larger European liberal culture, which would effectively destroy what was distinctively Islamic. The hijackers who attacked the World Trade Center clearly entertained such notions, and they had created for themselves a kind of deadly fantasy world in which the murder of thousands of people was equivalent to an armed defense of their community, which was under assault, if at all, only from larger and more impersonal forces, such as cultural change. And it is difficult to believe that any medieval Muslim cleric would have considered such changes to justify armed action. In this regard, it is interesting to note that within one of the letters, ostensibly left by one of the hijackers, we see a recommendation that they take plunder, even if only a glass of water. In other words, for these men, a glass of water in one of those plastic cups on the airplane while it was on its mission into the World Trade Center to kill thousands of people was somehow equivalent to plunder and was a religious obligation upon them. It's very hard to believe that anyone in the medieval world would have thought of this as anything other than foolishness. Arguments then about jihad and calls for jihad might have had little resonance in the contemporary Muslim world had it not been for the prolonged and devastating wars of the late 20th century in the countries of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia that I earlier described. In addition, and making the situation much worse, are the ways in which highly dictatorial governments have limited access to information while undertaking their own assaults on their own societies in the form of extreme repression and occasionally civil war. It is true that U.S. policy and the existence of Israel have posed significant ideological problems for these countries and often practical ones. But it is also true that the governments in this part of the world have frequently distorted the importance of the U.S. and Israel in world affairs in order to instill in their own populations a sense of profound fear and distrust for the rest of the world. What now about justice? In the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center, the American public has demanded justice, and the Bush administration has promised to provide it. What kind of justice can we seek? Absolute justice is not to be found in any human society, and consequently every society, including our own, is guilty of failing to uphold absolute justice. But it has never been the claim of the United States, or indeed of any liberal society, to perfection or to the maintenance of absolute justice. On the contrary, our brightest achievement has been to balance competing claims of justice while constantly keeping an eye on the practical implications of any policy for real human beings. Such justice as we can find in the modern world, therefore, lies somewhere between complacency and anger, between doing nothing and hitting too hard at the wrong targets. Before concluding this talk, I want to review the common wisdom about policy considerations that have driven people in Middle East countries to applaud on occasion the attacks on New York and Washington. But before I do that, I want to make two other points. The first is that the United States will have to become far more involved in the world beyond our borders. But in so doing, we must recognize that although the power of the United States is very great, it is not unlimited. And it is sometimes reassuring to believe that our power is unlimited, which is indeed something that Osama bin Laden himself seems occasionally to echo. But in fact, we must choose fairly carefully where we want to become involved. And wherever we become involved, we must be aware that in those societies, the decisions of the people who live there will be of paramount importance, and we can only affect life at the margins. Secondly, it is actually important to end the role of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, because it's very clear now that these are very dangerous people. They have attacked 2 embassies of the United States, causing the deaths of hundreds of African people. They have certainly attacked U.S. military installations, the USS Cole, and they have attacked civilians in the United States. This does not mean necessarily, however, that we should undertake a larger war against the peoples of the region or states whose policies we dislike. Now, what about the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, which last week Osama bin Laden suddenly claimed was his most important concern? An act of atrocious horror is not a policy argument, and the crucial policy questions that still confront the peoples of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia will require our attention. Reasonable people can continue to disagree about whether Israeli policy toward the Palestinians over the last several years has been wise, and whether the decisions of the Palestinian Authority, in many cases, have been any wiser. If you believe, as I did on September 9th, that the Israeli occupation was short-sighted, wrong, and often counterproductive, it has not become less so in the last month. A full discussion of the Arab-Israeli peace process and the Arab-Israeli wars would be a topic for another night. But one crucial lesson of the past 2 weeks is that Americans need to listen more carefully to both sides of the argument, and that the demonization of Palestinians in much of the Western media must stop, but so too must the corresponding demonization of Israel in much of the Arabic and Islamic media, a demonization of which Israelis are only too aware. The tragic events of the last year of the uprising by Palestinians known as the Intifada, including the deaths of many children, are a terrible reminder of how far we are from justice. But we must recall that they are equally tragically the common currency of states dealing with insurrection. Death does not have to be genocidal, nor does it have to be terror to be wrong. And in fact, it does not become right because it is not part of such a policy. It should also be clear to us now that in the world in which we live, only a president with the powers of the American president has the capacity to intervene effectively on behalf of peace in most of the world. And we can be certain that any intervention by an American president on behalf of peace will ultimately not be fully satisfying to everyone in the situation. That seems to me to be a reality of the world in which we live, but it is nevertheless a burden that for the United States, for the present, falls on the shoulders of the United States, and it is one that we cannot, as this administration attempted earlier in the year 2001, lightly to lay down. What about a much more important concern of Osama bin Laden? U.S. involvement with the monarchies of the Gulf. This is, in fact, an issue that has troubled Osama bin Laden and his followers since 1994. And their concern, often stated, is that the monarchies of the Gulf are corrupt and that they depend on the support of the United States to remain in place. There are two things that we need to recall. The first is that there is no doubt that the monarchies of the Gulf are often corrupt, occasionally cruel, and that their laws are, for most of us, terribly restrictive of human freedom. But there is also no doubt that these rulers have remained in power by their own political astuteness and not by the force of American arms. To the extent that they purchase American arms, they employ them far less against their own populations than effectively to assure themselves of votes in the American Congress. Now, it is certainly the case as well, despite the failings of these governments, that those who wish to see the monarchies of the Gulf, and especially the Saudi kingdom, destroyed, do not plan on replacing them by systems of Jeffersonian democracy. They would replace them by far more repressive regimes of the kind established in Afghanistan by the Taliban, or, alternatively, of the kind that presently exist in Iraq and Syria. It seems to me, therefore, that while there is much to criticize in the monarchies of the Gulf, it is certainly not our business to attempt to bring them down. What about the children of Iraq and the UN sanctions? Here I think we face a real dilemma. Sanctions are supposed, as in the case of South Africa, to be a substitute for violence. And the idea behind them was that they were to bring the Iraqi government to accept inspection for the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. This they have not done. Lifting the sanctions will lessen the misery of the people of Iraq, but it will probably also allow the Iraqi government to rebuild its capacity to make war on its neighbors. I'm not sure that there's an easy answer for this, although lifting the sanctions has much to be said for it. And yet, we must ask ourselves, as we try to understand the complicated world in which we live, why our government did not accuse Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government of being war criminals long ago. In 1980, Saddam Hussein initiated an unprovoked war against one of his neighbors. In 1984, he employed chemical weapons forbidden by international law, and that same year he was specifically condemned for using such weapons by the UN Security Council. Later, he undertook the deliberate bombing of cities of a neighboring country without regard to military targets, and he created his own economic blockade against a neighboring state in an attempt to starve it into submission. What was that neighboring state? It was, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And because in the 1980s, the United States was afraid of the growing power of the Islamic Republic of Iran, it was unwilling to take action against Saddam Hussein. This is perfectly understandable, although it may have been a less than completely wise decision. I wish that many of the peace activists who are legitimately and truly concerned about the children of Iraq today had been equally concerned about the children of Iran in the 1980s. Third, what about other forms of U.S. intervention in the world? The U.S. intervened directly to help Muslims in Kosovo when they were experiencing ethnic cleansing. In this case, the United States undertook to fight an air war against a state ostensibly led by Christians in order to protect a terrorized Muslim minority. And yet there seems to be very little awareness in the Middle East or North Africa of that particular aspect of American policy. What about areas of U.S. policy that require change that are more amenable to our direct influence? And here, I think we must say that it is important for the United States to play a far more forthright role in support of human rights around the world. One issue is certainly human rights at home, here in the United States, and this includes our guarantees of freedom of speech, worship, and personal security, and especially for those citizens and residents who are Arab or Muslim. This is important because it is part of what our country is like, and it is important because there appears to be a widespread sense in the Middle East and North Africa that we are now living through a period of more or less unrestrained violence against our Arab and Muslim co-residents. It is important that this perception not become more widespread. And the only way to ensure that it not become more widespread is to ensure that we continue to be an open society. But what about human rights outside the United States? There is frankly not much that we can do, but there is more that we can do than we have done. Human rights will not become the only focus of U.S. policy, nor will it become the central focus, nor do I even believe myself that it should become the highest priority. But it must become more central to American policymakers. We must encourage wider contacts at all levels between our society and those of people in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. An example was the recent meeting between the Catholic clergy and members of the Muslim ulama. If these meetings are successful, if there is open and honest dialogue they will be filled with disagreement and even on occasion with acrimony. But it is important that people honestly express their concerns. It is also important, and perhaps even more important, for those of us here to insist on safeguarding the lives and the freedom of those in North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia who themselves have a commitment to the values of expanding human freedom, and especially freedom of speech. The decision by the Egyptian government, for example, to try a sociology professor, Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, in front of a security court for exposing voter fraud is an example of something that should be far higher on the U.S. agenda. He was sentenced to 7 years in jail for insulting the Egyptian state because he made it clear that not all the votes were being counted accurately. Why should we be especially concerned with this case? Well, in the Northwest, we should be especially concerned because Saad ad-Din Ibrahim holds a PhD from the University of Washington. And it should therefore be something that we ask the leaders of this university and our local political figures to spend more time on. And just as we are concerned about the safety and the well-being of researchers and political activists in China or Latin America, so too we should be concerned about their safety and well-being in the Middle East. And freedom of speech, freedom of information is important because it is a way of dispelling the ideas that governments have propagated to instill fear in their populations. If many people in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia believe the nonsensical stories that Israeli intelligence planned the attacks on the World Trade Center, or that they fit into a larger American conspiracy, or that Americans are indulging in an orgy of violence against Arab and Muslim citizens here, it is because in highly repressive countries, people have very little access to a free press, to objective reporting, or how American society functions in the 21st century as opposed to the 19th century. Now, the attack on September 11th was on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. But I want to focus on the World Trade Center because it was perceived, and it was certainly intended to be, a symbolic act. And there appears to be a sense that the murder of secretaries and bond traders and janitors and construction workers and firefighters in the United States who came from across the globe, who were Israeli or Pakistani or Arab or British or from other parts of the world, is in itself only a matter of the deaths of the people involved. And I do not think that medieval Muslims would have taken quite so permissive an attitude to attacks on a building like the World Trade Center. Not because they would have believed that the murder of thousands of people was insignificant. They would have understood all too well the significance of mass murder. But because they would have had a somewhat different understanding than we have about what it means to pervert a transportation system and to attempt to destroy world trade. In the 14th century, the great Tunisian sociologist Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun wrote a book about human history. And in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan quoted Ibn Khaldun's work in regard to taxes. But Ibn Khaldun was concerned with far more than taxation. He was concerned with how human beings lived with each other. And he wrote his work steeped within the framework of the Islamic tradition and Islamic law. And what Ibn Khaldun wrote was that human beings cannot live on their own. Human beings can only live by relationships with other human beings. And therefore, if they are to survive, they must engage in trade. Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun understood that those who engage in trade and business activity are not necessarily heroic, and that they are engaged in the pursuit of their own interest, but he also understood that economic, social, and cultural interchange between people is essential if human society is to survive. And indeed, as all Muslims know, before the Prophet Muhammad was a warrior, he was a merchant. And the Quran is at least as concerned to set down the rules governing trade as it is to set down the rules governing war. To attack global trade in so brutal, if ultimately futile a way as occurred on September 11th, was therefore an attack on human society and on the foundations that make human society possible. And the people who did it are therefore indeed enemies of humanity, as I believe all classical Muslim thinkers would have recognized. Thank you.